the 5 years ahead for China's economy, social development, and even politics. Professor Zhu, from your perspective as a Chinese economist, what are the things you would pay extreme close attention to about this specific meeting of the party?
Well, I think there are three things that I pay very close attention to. The first thing is I think this is a meeting that is known for having a personal arrangement for the next party leadership. So I think this is very important for whoever is going to take charge of those important areas of administration. So I think this is the first area that I'm paying close attention to. The second is this is still a meeting that is about economics, especially given that we're wrapping up the 12th five-year plan and we're starting the 13th five-year plan in the next year. So I think this is a place where I think all the leaders of the party are going to convene to talk about what are the priorities, what are the balances, and what are the trade-offs to be made in the next 5 years, which is very critical for China's economic transition. And the last, and certainly not the least, is about what are the new reform agendas which are going to take shape. I mean, there are many important areas in economics even, of fiscal and the taxation reforms, about the reform of the SOEs, and also the goal or how to handle the very dynamic and very fast-changing international economic and finance arena.
Yes, indeed. Those 3 points are extremely important. But on the other hand, Mr. Ross, one point seems to be extremely important. That is, whether China will devote its efforts, quote unquote, stabilizing its economic growth rate, which is now apparently under 7%, or is it going to put more of its attention into the so-called restructuring of its economy? That is the crucial point that people are looking at. Mr. Ross, what's your observation?
I don't think that's quite the right way to pose the question. The key goal is not the GDP growth rate. GDP is merely a means to an end. Real key figures, the ones that I'm looking for, will be the ones on rate of growth of consumption, which has to be around 6.5%, 7% in order to meet the target of becoming a moderately prosperous society in 2020. What is the energy consumption per unit of GDP, because that affects climate change? That's been falling very satisfactorily. And also some measures on environmental pollution, for example, and clearing that up. These, I think, are the really crucial factors. High GDP growth is necessary, but it's not the end in itself. It's just to achieve these other goals.
You might say so. However, it is still very important for the country to figure out, particularly after some of the stock market turmoil and the questions many around the world have about the slowdown of the Chinese economy, where the country really wants to focus its policy on. So for that point, let me go to Dr. Xiao Gang in Hong Kong. Dr. Xiao, what do you make about that point? To what extent do you think the new plan, the new 5-year plan, should focus on in terms of the structural reform vis-a-vis the growth rate? The growth rate is not the growth rate itself, as we see as a number, but rather how others are perceiving China and how China is projecting itself to the rest of the world. Dr. Xiao.
Yes, the focus definitely will be on quality growth and also sustainable growth. So the growth rate itself is not so important, but I think the structural reforms required are actually very important, especially the innovation, because in order to have sustainable growth, it is necessary for China to really have innovative, companies and also the regions. That's the crucial, factors to drive productivity growth.
It is not the first time that China talk about growth or particularly talk about reform in its 5-year plan. It is not the very first time that we, even sitting in the studio, talk about how urgent the agenda is. And yet, Professor Zhu, we've been seeing the same points being repeated, talking about the urgency and the areas of reform back in the 1990s. and some of those still have not been finished yet today. So the question is whether the current administration with Chinese President Xi Jinping and others will be able to put all of these things back onto the agenda and to also implement them within the next 5 years. That reflects a lot about both the capability of governing and the ambition of governing.
Well, I think the ambition is definitely there. I think even if it's not for the ambition, it's definitely the urgency itself. I mean, I think China has never faced such a paramount amount of challenges and transitions in the past 3 decades. So I think
what kind of paramount transitions and changes are you talking about briefly?
Well, I think we're talking about unprecedented low growth rate. We're talking about unprecedented fast growth of debt, and we're talking about a lot of deterioration in the environment. So I think those are things which have not been faced by the Chinese leadership in the past 2 decades. So I think I'm very confident that I think the new leadership understands how severe the situation is, and they definitely have the ambition. I think the question is the execution part. And I think there, because that we have been dragging along some of the old questions for so long, I think that the resistance is growing stronger and stronger by itself as well. So I think it is a lot easier to reform certain areas. For example, the SOEs a decade ago than it is to do that now. So I think they definitely, the new leadership, the current leadership, they have stronger resolutions to engage in the reform. However, the resistance is also getting stronger. So I think it is sort of a dynamic between the two sides, and hopefully, I think, the will to reform further is going to overpower the other side, and we will see more meaningful and more concrete actions being taken in pushing forward the reforms.
Mr. Ross, we've seen already quite a number of platforms, new ideas, new mechanisms over the past few years being debated, discussed, and also even implemented. Just to name a few, AIIB, Silk Road initiatives, and also some of the others, Belt and Road initiatives, not to mention the South and South cooperation internationally practiced. China certainly loves it, and investing in some of the developing countries. All these can be mechanisms in which China's reform can be carried out. However, it seems that it's more dealing with China's relations with others rather than dealing with its internal restructuring and structural reform. So, Mr. Ross, what do you think about the new ideas that might come out about the internal reform that China urgently is facing now? Mr. Ross.
Well, I think the crucial thing is this 5-year plan really represents something qualitatively new, because at the end of it, assuming that it's carried out successfully, and China normally does, China will achieve what is called a moderately prosperous society. Or if we want to put it in international standards, on the brink of being the World Bank definition of a high-income economy. But this is really genuinely something world-changing. About 20% of the world's population lives in high-income economies by World Bank definition, but China is 19%. It's going to transform, double in one step, the number of people who are going to be in high-income economies. And in this, you cannot separate the international matters, because China has to go global to achieve this, so that concentration that is correct. Secondly, the decisive factor internally is the question of research and development. Innovation of various types, both new products, but above all in what's called cost innovation, and really ramping up the scientific and technological basis of the society to make a transition to high value-added production. That's the driving force of the economic plan.
Right. Dr. Xiao, on the other hand, by going global, will China be able to solve its own internal structural problems, particularly some of the urgent matters when it comes to reform? Will necessarily going external helping with internally?
Well, I think it definitely is. We had experience of joining the WTO. The external opening to the external market actually will help China's internal market efficiency, and this can be seen very clearly in terms of technological transfer and also the efficiency of the capital. Because a lot of foreign investment companies that they have much higher efficiency in the use of capital. and those are putting pressures on the domestic economy. And also the opening up helps to realize China's purchasing power, to the outside world, and that will, in return, help stimulate the Chinese economy.
We've seen the past 3 5-year plans playing its distinctive role in the history of China's economic development. For example, in the 10th plan, the GDP target was an average annual economic growth rate of about 7%. The plan also aimed to increase the number of urgent employees, boost levels of urbanization, and kickstart the operation of more infrastructure facilities. The goal of the 11th 5-year plan were to boost the annual GDP to 7.5%, increase the share of the Chinese service industry's value, and also China's urbanization rate. And for the 12th 5-year plan, the targets were to grow GDP by around 7% and boost the urbanization rate. Other targets include expanding China's highway networks, building 36 million units of low-price apartments, and developing e-commerce industry. These are all very specific targets that you outline in a 5-year plan. But the question now is, I want to come back to you, to the very hard part, Professor Zhu. It seems that these very specific goals, this is a tradition in China's economic plan, setting goals, setting numbers, setting timelines. But this is not enough. The most important thing is to have the ambition and the capability, not just to set the numbers, but rather to really reform. And where would that come from? The force to push forward the reform, the force to be able to implement the reform, Professor Zhu. I know this is a question for everyone, but I want to have your input here.
Yeah, I think the push or the motivation behind most reforms in Chinese economy, at least in the past few decades, is crisis, or is the realization that the old model cannot sustain itself any further. So
but we have realized for that quite some time, haven't we?
I think yes, but then I think after the 2008 global financial crisis and with the 4 trillion stimulus packages, I think we sort of get a revival of the old model, and it sustained Chinese economy for another few years of high-speed growth. However, I think the problem is actually getting even worse after those few years. So I think now is really, there's no escaping in realizing what the old model cannot be sustained anymore. So I think that is where the motivation comes from.
Right.
And the execution or the implementation, I think it comes from 2 areas. I think we probably touched upon that briefly. One is through further openness. I think be it the liberalization of the RMB or the relaxation of the capital flow account, and be it the One Belt, One Road initiative, I think that is all trying to embrace China into the greater international rule, international framework. So I think that is one thing. The second thing is, I think it has to go back into China into how to strike the balance between the state and the economy. I mean, specifically, how to, I think, to simplify the administration and to reduce the power of the administrators. And I think that is a really difficult part, because that is basically asking whoever is possessing those powers right now to give up those powers.
Yes,
which is
indeed. And those are also doing the planning at the same time.
Exactly.
So it is a very tough task.